May I speak in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. Thinking about saints, particularly saints who are from our own country, it can be helpful to think about who we are. And today, while I was visiting with folks after the 8 a.m. service, I had the pleasure of talking with Bobby Gaines, who you might recognize as the erstwhile acolyte, crucifer, general knowledge bank of all things Emmanuel. And he comes by that honestly, and he has a special story that connects with this parish. So Bobby Gaines' grandparents were married in this parish church over 100 years ago. And that's a wonderful thing. And many people know where their home parish is, and that's great and good. But Bobby Gaines' parents, his grandparents, were a mixed-race couple. His grandmother was from the British West Indies, and his father was from this parish church. And them being married here in this church, not in the rector's office, not by a justice of the peace, and not in someone's home, says a lot about who this church was and who it is. Even more so, their daughter, Bobby's mother, made sure that her children, her family, went to this church. That says that she was loved and accepted and knew that this was her home. That might sound silly, but remember that in the 1950s, Dr. Martin Luther King called the American church the most segregated hour in American culture. So that means a lot. And I'm not saying we rest on our laurels, but I want to point out that there are small and great things that have profound effects on people's lives. And that the conversation about race, about this country, isn't divorced from our reality as people sitting in the pews. Imagine if things had gone very differently. Maybe Bobby's family would have moved away to a place like Providence or Boston or Worcester. But he is here, and you are here, as part of a great continuing witness of people who have said there is room for all of God's people at God's table. So you are the church of the people, and that in the very best sense of the world. We are a denomination that used to have pew ranks. Churches of the people were special and are special places. That is one of your charisms. Hold closely to that. And let's think a little bit about this man, Absalom Jones. When we talk about saints, we do have to remember history, and it's important to remember that Absalom Jones wasn't born into the deep south somewhere that was yet a part of the United States. No, there wasn't a United States when he was born. He was born into the Pennsylvania colony, actually Delaware, and then he quickly moved to Pennsylvania. And his life was a life, like many people who had been humanly trafficked. His life was a life of servitude. But he was an incredibly intelligent man who found a way to buy his own freedom and the freedom of his wife. Did remarkable things. We can talk about those and what those were, but the bottom line about this is that he was an exemplar of Christian service in the city and recognized for that. He and his friend Richard Allen built a free Africa society for people who, many of whom had been recently freed after the Revolutionary War. And the reality was there were really awful things, as you might imagine, that were happening for people. And people were saying, why don't those people who are free go back to Africa? And they said, well, no, thank you. We are here. And we'd like to stay where we are, where our families are, where we call home. This crosses with our own church when he made the decision that he wanted to be an Episcopalian. He wanted to be ordained in our church, and it took him almost 30 years to do that. And I say that because when it takes 5 years and you want to get ordained, it seems like a long time. But 30 years is a terribly long time. He was a man of letters, a man who wrote in exceedingly accurate and helpful ways about the conditions that he found people living in. The largest population of African Americans in the whole United States was living in Pennsylvania, so he's writing about that. But I want to ask if we've ever thought about how human trafficking in the early part of the colonial reality and throughout that time intersects with a place like Rhode Island. Some of you are aware that Rhode Island is a place that's, like New Bedford, widely known for shipping. Shipping is what built this state. And shipping is also a nice way of talking about human trafficking across the Atlantic. That was the primary way that people made money on shipping. There was whaling, but the real money was found in that gold. That was the real fortune to be made. Not just here, but in New York, Wall Street, the exchange. All of those things were put into place for the great commodity that was the incredible, economy-building, amazing thing that was happening in the United States, which was human capital, the human trafficking of African people. And it's hard to talk about those things because sometimes I think the first reaction is to feel very ashamed or maybe defensive. But if we don't know who we are or where we're from, how can we talk about what's happening today? Not in a shaming way, but just to talk about it. When you think about what we do together as church, every time we come together, we tell the story of our salvation. We recount the same story. I mean, we don't have any other stories. Every time we come to the table, we talk about how God created the world and how human beings didn't know how to live in it and how we broke a bunch of things. And then God came into the world in a very obvious way and we broke a bunch of things, including Jesus, and how God did not rest. And God came and redeemed us by overcoming our great enemy, death. We tell our story as Christian people because we believe that in telling the story, we are somehow remade. And the same is true for our own stories. When you think about the story of your family, of your grandparents, of your children, those stories matter. And for those of you who are a little more seasoned, sometimes you see traces of things from your family in children who have never met their grandparents. And the same is true for us. So today we're thinking about a man whose life and liberty was given to the proposition that every single person had the right to stand in the assembly of those who received communion. That might sound obvious to us today, but even this parish church stands as an exemplar of how seldom we get that. This is the church of the people because maybe some other people didn't want the people that served them to have communion with them on Sundays. Maybe they didn't want people whose clothes might be a little tattered or who had the same one dress for Sunday to stand with them at the altar. But this church stands in opposition to that. It says that may be what you think, but we know who we are. And I see you reaching out in all of these ways, great and small, to, in the words of Mark Miller, that we're going to sing a little bit later, draw that circle wider. So I want to challenge us to not be afraid to look at the things that are hard. To not be afraid to celebrate the incredible courage and wisdom of a man who said, I will be a priest. You will not prevent me. God has shown me. Who broke a great barrier, started a great tradition of which I am the product. I am a Black Episcopalian for many generations. My family's been Episcopalian on one side of my family. And because of a man like him, I have a place in the church that wasn't given, but was surely wrestled from the church. And for that, I'm grateful. But our work doesn't end there, because all around us we see the remnants and the realities of these kinds of divisions. And what we're meant to experience here at the Eucharistic feast is the proclamation of what God has already told us about what is good. How can we say that we love God whom we do not see and not love one another? And how do we know who we love? With whom will we eat? I can tell you that you probably don't invite your hated enemies to your home to have food with you for some good reasons. You know, who wants that kind of stink in the place where you live? Who wants to be feeling like it's all been contaminated by people you don't like? But the lesson at the Eucharist is this is not only God's table, but God's imagination of what's meant to be happening. This is the beginning, not the end. So as we, each and every one of us, regardless of who we are, or maybe precisely because of who we are, get the very same thing. Priest and layperson. People of every background, experience, expression, political affiliation. We each get the same. This is the great leveler. This is who we really are. Do we have the imagination to be people who help usher that in to the places and spaces where we live the other 6 days? And I would say for this church, the answer is yes. It is yes. And you can, and you will, and you are. But first, friends, we have to see with eyes that are brave and honest to make right those things that are wrong. May we have the eyes of blessed Absalom, not only to look out for ourselves, but for those who are vulnerable. May we have the heart of Christ to reach out to a world that is splintered and fractured and every day seems to disintegrate a little more, trusting in that Eucharistic miracle and its power to save us and this world.